Whew. All right, I think it is recording now. Looks like everything is good. All right, everybody. Hello, and thank you for participating, coming to this forum. We get to hear leftist perspectives about the war on Ukraine. I have in mind, my name is Robert Eckstut, and I'd like to hear a little introduction from all of the panelists. You'd like to start, Hanna?
Yeah, hi. Thanks a lot for inviting us. My name is Hanna Perekhoda. I am a PhD student in Lausanne University in Switzerland. I study political history, and I am also a member of Committee of Solidarity with Ukraine and with Russian anti-war activists.
All right, welcome. Catherine, how about you?
Hi, thank you very much also for invitation. I am a French citizen. I'm involved in political activity, internationalist activity since more than 6 decades. And I have been involved, I am an economist involved in internationalist networks of the Fourth International, and also I am involved now in European network in solidarity with Ukrainian resistance in facing this war. I will explain why.
All right, welcome. How about you, Vaush?
Hello, my name is Vaush. Actually, it's Ian. That's the real name. And I am a YouTuber. I have a bachelor's in sociology, but it's really the YouTubing for which I'm primarily known. Happy to be here.
All right, welcome, welcome. And Denis, how about yourself?
I'm Denis Pilash, and I'm an assistant professor of political science and international relations at the Kyiv National University. But first and foremost, I am a left-wing activist here in Ukraine. I'm a member of the democratic socialist organization called Соціальний рух, the social movement, and also the editorial board of the local journal called Commons, as a magazine for social criticism. Again, very excited to be here. Thanks.
All right. So the format more or less today is we're going to hear from all of our panelists. Then I have some questions, some of which are from DSA members, some of which are from myself. But without further ado, I'd like to hear from everybody. So I believe we're going to start with Hanna.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so Ukraine, let's start with the fact. Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe, after Russia, of course. Its population now, until now, was about 40 million people. No, so it's a huge country. But its history is very little known, and it remained somehow in the shadow of the Russian historical narrative. And yeah, I would like to say it clearly from the start. Just my opinion is that I think it's partly because of the ignorance of a historical dimension of Russian-Ukrainian relations that we are now witnesses of this war that Putin's army wages against the Ukrainian population. So let's speak about some historical aspects first. In our imagery, the notion of colonization mainly refers to the political domination and economic exploitation of some distant lands located overseas, inhabited by people radically different from the ethnic and cultural point of view. And this was actually the case for the European maritime empires. Their centers were separated from their colonies by the oceans, but in continental empires like Russia, it was more difficult to draw the boundaries between the center and the periphery. And Russian colonialism was not only a colonization, but also a huge project of assimilation. For centuries, Russia was building a continental empire that was not only conquering in other peoples, but that also tried to assimilate them. So Ukrainians were ruled by those who didn't recognize them as a separate political, cultural community, considering them instead as a part of their own community. And the absence, for instance, of a racial difference between the colonizer and the colonized, and the cultural proximity made their assimilation less visible to outsiders. And even in the 20th century, when Ukrainians already had their own formal statehood, the population was subject to assimilation policy. And despite the slogans about the friendship of Soviet nations, the Russian language and culture were de facto the only ones to be promoted. And more non-Russians in the USSR abandoned their cultures and languages that were perceived as inferior. So yeah, the Russian imperialism and Russian colonialism didn't enter our common imagination about colonialism, which remains paradoxically very, very Western-centered, because we know what our Western imperial domination looked like. We are interested to study it. We try to deconstruct its heritage, but up until now, we ignore the non-Western empires and non-Western imperialism because they are perceived as kind of exotic exceptions from the norm. So yeah, Ukraine, as you know, became independent in 1991, but Russian domination and revanchist ambitions persisted, because actually the status quo was never really put into question. The status quo in which actually the former colonial core Russia has some kind of a right, a legitimate right to dominate fully its former colonial peripheries, like post-Soviet states and Ukraine in particular. Just a few words about the Russian contemporary imperialism. It's somehow driven by the resentment of fallen or failed empire. It's an imperialism of a state that do not have any attractive political or economical project to propose to the rest of the world. So it can only rely on its military force, as we can see now. This is also an imperialism of a mission, because it is convinced in defending conservative, traditionalist, anti-modernist values, and it's moving more and more towards fascism. It has clear fascization tendencies. And the last word that I wanted to say, and it's, I think we risk to have a debate over this problematic, that in my opinion, Putin is not so threatened by NATO or the West or the USA as he wants us to believe. I think his main enemy is the people, because any attempt of popular uprising is something Putin destroys without mercy. And his main fear is that the peoples with whom the Russians have strong ties, like Ukrainians, Belarusian, Kazakhs, etc., that they will somehow succeed, for example, to bring down their autocratic regimes, to build more democratic societies, to eradicate corruption, to get rid of mafia that took over the state institutions. Because in this case, the Russians may wonder and may ask, what about us? Why do we continue to tolerate an inefficient and corrupt state? Why do we allow a few dozens of oligarchs to monopolize the wealth of our country, to humiliate us, to exploit us, to earn billions on our blood so they could have a luxury life in the West, of course. And the fear that the Russians will receive their sight is what drives Putin into these military adventures that can seem almost irrational to us. But I think they are very logical and very rational, since Putin must actually maintain at all costs the system which allows his friends to continue to enrich themselves and to plunder Russian wealth. Putin cannot simply betray those who put him in power 22 years ago. So yes, as I see it, it's not against NATO, but against the people's political will and political agency that Putin wages a war, and he wages it for years already. And up till now, we did practically nothing to stop it. And the invasion and the war in Ukraine is kind of a culmination of this process. So what we have now is that people of Ukraine are killed by thousands, and those of the whole region are taken hostage by Putin and his clan, and they are ready for any barbarity. And yeah, I know it could be maybe hard to believe for somebody, but this time it's not the Western imperialism, but the Russian one that started the war and that threatens the world. And we're on the verge of a huge international crisis, and we need to face it and also to search for solutions. Otherwise, these solutions can be provided by those who know how to give, easy answers. I mean, the extreme right. And we have the problem of extreme right populism in Europe, but also in USA. So I will stop here. Thank you very much.
That was fantastic. I'll definitely, for the Q&A, have some follow-ups, especially about Putin fearing the people, not so much NATO. So we'll revisit that in a little bit. Denis, I believe you are next.
Yeah, so here in Ukraine, we have passed already 2 months of this bloody war that was started with unilateral aggression of the Russian right-wing dictatorship, and that has already resulted in deaths of tens of thousands of people, and also we have tens of millions whose lives have been broken, who lost their homes or who just had to relocate to become either refugees in some other European states or to move to a safer, relatively safer parts of Ukraine. So actually, even this week, that was a week between the Easters on Catholic West right and Orthodox East right, we had lots of strikes throughout the country on different cities. And actually, people have been and are dying throughout the country, as in big cities like in Kiev, Kharkiv, Odessa, Lviv. But in some places where the hostilities were going on and now are, the intensity is really enormous. And that part of the invasion that moved from the north and moved to Kiev, for instance, it has been already repelled, but it also revealed the scale of the atrocities in Kiev region, in the suburbs of Kiev like Irpin, Bucha, Hostomel. And actually, now we can say that while this the entire war is an act of aggression, is a war crime of aggression, is something that is obviously in the line of aggressions of all other imperialisms, be it the Western one, as Hanna mentioned. Yes, we were we all know very well what happened to Iraq and what happened to other places that were attacked by US military, and Russia did this with no less recklessness. But also these atrocities ranging from all types of violence, sexual violence, mass executions. It really reminds us of some of the worst conflicts of our times, and it has been compared to Srebrenica and these wars of at former Yugoslavia. But I would also invoke examples like the 1970s Western Pakistani army suppressing the Eastern Pakistani, now Bangladeshi population, or Indonesian dictator Suharto, East Timor. So it's really on this verge of ethnic cleansing and total destruction of the not just infrastructure but of the population as well. And now we have entire towns in different parts of the countries that have been almost completely destroyed. And obviously it also reminds us of the worst pages in our history, for instance, of the Nazi invasion against the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Ukraine was also heavily affected. And but actually what's one of the parallels is also that as in that time, the Second World War, also the dictator in his bunker, he's meeting some very overwhelming resistance on the side of the population, not just military. And actually now we have not just these hundreds of thousands of people who enlisted to either to the armed forces of Ukraine or to the territorial defense units, but we also have millions of people, essential workers and volunteers in different humanitarian initiatives that actually do everything to help others and to keep the things running, to they actually constituting this backbone of the resistance here in Ukraine. So men and women, people, Russian-speaking, Ukrainian-speaking, people of other ethnic backgrounds, Jews, Greeks, Armenians, Azeris, you can continue. Even the most dispossessed and the most discriminated communities in Ukraine, like the Roma people. We were just recently distributing some aid to the local Roma population, and in this city, as in some others, they were crucial to constitute the local territorial defense units. So many people of the Roma communities that had been probably the most excluded in Ukrainian and other Eastern European societies. And also just to draw your attention to what has been done by the railway workers who evacuated millions of people, who saved their lives, by the healthcare workers who are risking their lives, and as hospitals, as well as other objects like schools, are being targeted by the Russian missiles and the Russian aircraft, and they are there at close to the front line and saving human lives. And then you have also stories from everywhere, from say the people on the nuclear power plants, including those that have been already occupied or attacked, and who also were doing their best to ensure that the safety is under control and there will be no meltdown and no new Chernobyl. So actually, you have also these spontaneous solidarity networks with people helping those who are fleeing to seeking some asylum, and also distributing humanitarian aid, medicine, food, and getting it to those who are in need. And people from our organization, the social movement, and from the unions are very engaged in all these processes. And actually, we also have to do the necessary work to protect the rights of the people in these harsh times of war, as we understand that any ruling class can use the opportunity to somehow curb, for instance, the labor rights, and that has been one of the most specific thing done by our comrades to address those same essential workers who are now sort of crucial for the resistance, but whose rights are being targeted by the bosses. And just recent week, we again had an attempt to push through a neoliberal law that would make easier to sack people, sack workers, and to diminish their rights. Fortunately, it failed, and again, we need to stay mobilized to vigil all such attempts. And we also need to provide international solidarity for the people of Ukraine, and to put forward both those demands that are urgent for this moment. So obviously, people here, they need any kind of assistance, any kind of aid, humanitarian aid for refugees, all people who had to flee from Ukraine, regardless of their origin and citizenship, but also, and I know that's for many people in the Western left, it's a controversial issue, but the issue of weapons delivery, again, just in order to survive, because it's a really existential issue now, whether we will exist not just as some separate entity, but politically as a separate republic, but also whether we will physically exist, especially given scale of these war crimes and crimes against humanity. And just some anti-aircraft weapon, it can protect civilians in the cities from the Russian missiles and Russian bombs. But also we put forward more far-fetching political and economic demands that are very important for running the economy in times of war, but especially to recover, to rebuild, reconstruct the country after the war. And we push these demands, also showing that all these are not just issues of the war, of this Russian war against Ukraine, but also the issues that are needed globally, that respond to the challenges that people throughout the world are facing. For instance, we are demanding the cancellation of Ukrainian external debt, and it's an issue that's in common for many peripheral countries. Ukraine, one of the poorest countries in Europe, but the same issue is well known for the people in the global south, and this vicious circle of debt and IMF induced austerity. And just in order to have just society and just to again to be able to reconstruct, we need to relieve this burden. And if we succeed, it will be a good template for all other countries, all other peoples who are struggling against the same problem. Then we have the issue for the same reconstruction. You will need massive investment, and we need to provide a more progressive, more socially just, socially oriented framework for this, in order to rebuild all the destroyed infrastructure and to really ensure that this will be for the sake of the society, for the sake of people, not for some vested interests of some businesses. And then we in general can raise these issues, for instance, like Putin's criminal war in Ukraine, or Saudi Arabia's criminal war in Yemen. They show how these two pressuring issues of existential threats to humanity are interconnected. Both countries are fossil fuel empires. And here we see how the issue of war and possible destruction of the humanity and the life on Earth by means of war is connected to another destruction of human and other life on Earth by climate change. And we need to really propose an eco-socialist alternative to the existing neoliberal capitalism, heavily relying on fossil fuels, and also on all these wars of aggression and so on. So, and in general, we need to look forward to some alternative to the existing world order. When you have big players, these grand powers, imperialists, who view, especially in case of Putin's Russia, who really denies any kind of agency for not just Ukrainians, but particularly Ukrainians, and Putin is constantly addressing that it's the fault of the Russian Revolution, of the Bolsheviks and Lenin, that Ukraine exists. And he's really this referring to this great Russian chauvinism of the Tsarist Empire. But in general, that you have these imperialist powers, and you have the smaller countries, smaller people who are subjected to their aggressions, and they're trying to subjugate them into their spheres of influence. And we really need to democratize the world order, to give a perspective from below, to give a perspective from those who had been oppressed and dispossessed and denied agency and subjectivity. So all this, it really shows how this particular war is not just an threat for the region, and but it also raises the same issues that are important for the humanity. So it's quite important to hear people from the ground and to do comparisons, and also to provide any solidarity you can to not just relieve the situation of people here, but also to try to create a more solidary, just and free world in perspective. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. We have a question about the IMF later. You had mentioned that in your speech, so hopefully we get to that. Catherine, I believe you're up next in the order.
Okay. Yes. First of all, I want to say that I fully share what Hanna and Denis just presented, fully. I want to give some insight about the debate which divide the, in particular, Western left. I am a kind of dinosaur of that Western left as an internationalist since decades, I have said, but I want to summarize my point of view in 3 points, like Denis and Hanna said just before. When I go to a demonstration today in France, for instance, with Ukrainian person participating, they say, if Russian troops stop fighting, there will be no more war. And if Ukrainian force stop fighting, there will be no more Ukraine. That is the key issue, because resistance of Ukrainian force needs arms, needs different aspect of the resistance, which Denis has described, armed and non-armed elements of resistance. But the second point is that in general, the left is denying the very existence of the society of Ukraine. And that is my second emphasis. My second emphasis in the debate within the Western left is to criticize those who reduce all interpretation of big events, in particular since 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union, all those who resume big events in through a kind of prism which is given by world order and imperialist competitions, or the main imperialist points of view. And this kind of emphasis denied the very possibility of a society and with its complexity and its conflicts to resist world order. And that is precisely what is now the issue. And I'm absolutely convinced, and I would try to support this idea, that supporting Ukrainian resistance, armed and non-armed resistance, meaning supporting all democratic, social, egalitarian rights of that society, is the way which would permit to get rid also to the militarization of the world and to get rid of NATO and the dissolution of NATO, which is, on my point of view, an issue since its very beginning, and in particular, which is an issue since 91, since the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, is simply today not understandable and cannot be supported in all Eastern European countries confronted to Russian aggression, if there is no defeat of that concrete aggression. Well, I must precise with what kind of point of view I developed this view. In '68, as a dinosaur, I said, I was fighting against Soviet Union intervention in Czechoslovakia with Soviet tanks. And I was involved in the committee in France and in other links in Europe for a free and socialist Czechoslovakia. There was no problem of NATO there, but already a great Russian Stalinist kind of domination, which was a very radical obstacle to the real building of a socialist alternative to the capitalist world. After 1989, I thought I was involved for my professional activity, but also for my political activity. I have been involved in the study and then political activity in Yugoslavia, in the former Yugoslavia. And I was fighting against the way the US power used the Yugoslav crisis, and afterwards the Soviet crisis also in 91 in particular, and in 99 in Kosovo, to rebuild, to maintain, to extend, and to rebuild NATO when it should have been dissolved. So my point of view is paradoxically, I am both in favor of sending arms to help the Ukrainian resistance, even from NATO's countries, because the arms are produced mainly by NATO's countries today. But I'm against the consolidation of a world dominated by NATO and by any bloc. And that means also the defeat of a Russian imperialist bloc itself. I came in contact with the Ukrainian left, through the first experience, which was the beginning of the present ongoing war, that is Maidan, what is called Maidan revolt and upsurge. That is the big crisis in 2014. And that was my first experience of a contact with the Ukrainian left, which Hanna and Denis expressed very well, which helped me to fight against a Western kind of approach of even Maidan crisis at that time. That is, I am and I was in opposition to bilateral kind of dominant propaganda and presentation of that crisis. First, the rosy picture of the European Union presenting Maidan as a pro-European Union upsurge, when in fact Maidan upsurge became massive popular social upsurge against Yanukovych power because of its repression and because of its way of functioning and deciding to suppress possibility of partnership with the European Union, choosing more Russian kind of proposal. But the problem was not for the dominant part of the Ukrainian society the issue of being pro-UA like that. The issue was to have the right to choose. The issue was freedom. And the issue was against a repressive force of Yanukovych at that time, and the way he decided by himself in a very pyramidal way of functioning. And so the presentation of Maidan as pro-EU is a simplification, but the presentation by Putin of Maidan as a fascist coup, an anti-Russian fascist coup, is a complete caricature too. And that was also the beginning of a war which was going on since years, with more than 15,000 deaths since 2014, and a deadline and an impasse. I mean, and this. I must stress that at the period of Maidan, the majority of the society, and Hanna and Denis could say more than I can do about that. The majority of the society was more in favor of neutrality on the military point of view for Ukraine than in favor of NATO. That was not at all the issue. And I would say that even in Donbass, pro-separatist current represented at maximum 20%, and even the so-called Popular Republic of Donbass do not represent the majority of the opinion of the population there, and more broadly, do not represent the what was the feeling and the attitude of the Russophone, the Russian-speaking part of the population in that region. You could have conflicts within Ukraine about the language issue. You could have conflict within Ukraine on the democratic way of organizing that society. Our comrade, for example, of Socialny Ruch, like also Denis stressed it, has launched fights against the IMF kind of imposition of criteria, which are the very same criteria that the European Union tries to impose to all Eastern European countries and to Ukraine. That is the destruction of social services, the reduction of social rights in defense of the oligarch powers. And even within the war, as Denis stressed, and it was the case at that time in 2014, the dilemma, which is a forced dilemma for that society, was to choose, and I would refuse such a choice, between the kind of gas energy war that was launched by Putin to impose its own rule and relationship of domination, and on the other side, the other kind of diktat, which the IMF or the UA wanted to impose against social rights and in protecting more oligarchs than workers. So my emphasis was and is still now on the society that is also on its very resistance as a real agency to build out of his own resistance different axes to rebuild another kind of relationship between people in Europe and in the world. Through what dimensions? First, of course, the social, eco-social, ecological and social justice, which is a very important issue, but you cannot even discuss this if you don't exist. That is, if Ukraine doesn't exist as a political society with its own rule and its own democracy to be built. And of course, if I would say that the first effect of Putin attacks since 2014 up to now, and now more than ever, is to consolidate a Ukrainian kind of identity, which is very different from a fascist, racist kind of Ukrainian identity, which exists also. So you have different kind of nationalism or different kind of Ukrainian national pride, if you want. The first one is anti-Russian, is a racist, is would not be in favor of the pluralist dimension of Ukraine, and would also impose its own interpretation of the Ukrainian past, whereas there is the need for all the currents in Ukraine to get rid of the crimes of the past, be they the crimes of the fascist and Nazi forces, or the crimes of the Stalinist domination in Ukraine. And that means a complete freedom of historical research, which is very rich in Ukraine today, on the point of view of a Marxist approach, a socialist approach, of an alternative socialist conception of the society, which recognize the right of self-determination of all nations as a precondition of the building of an alternative society and of an alternative union of people. That is why I fought against Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia, but it was also the case against Soviet intervention in Hungary. And it is today, of course, a precondition of the building of an anti-capitalist Ukraine and Europe and the world to defend the right of self-determination of Ukrainian people. And I will finish with just some comments about alternatives which are dividing the left, international left. There is the first kind of position which considers that there is only one imperialism, that is NATO, and which says the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and which consider without any criticism anyone which opposes NATO. So if the Russian power says and proclaim that is launching the war against NATO, so they would support Putin's war. In fact, there is, of course, a problem of NATO, but that is not the reason of the war. The reason of the war is what has been said by Hanna and Denis before, and that has been said explicitly by Putin, launching the war, which was anti-Leninist, against any recognition in the building of Soviet Union under Lenin's rule at the time of Belarus and of Ukraine as a separate nation with Russia. And so Putin's against Lenin and in support of Stalin and in support of the old great Russian imperial ideology. So there is another imperialism. So a second position in the left is to say, okay, there are two imperialisms, Russian imperialism and NATO, but they are put on the same level of course, in our political analysis before the war and after the war, we should put all imperialism in the same basket, of course, and the articulation of their confrontation and also alliance. Because, by the way, the Russian power under Yeltsin was supported by NATO when he was launching his war in Chechnya. And Russia was in favor of being member of partnership within NATO, and they are a certain interest in launching the war in Syria, and so on. So I mean, there is no one progressive imperialist and another one which would not be. Both are, like it was said before me, with the very same anti-social, anti-democratic, with, of course, a very specific transformation of different current within the world into fascist one. And there are trends toward fascism in Western countries, like in France, and there are trends of that kind in the transformation of the autocratic regime of Putin into a fascist one, which is suppressing trade union rights, political rights, and all possibility to express even in media criticism and so on. So a part of the left recognize this now, but say, like in the First World War, we are confronted to a war between two imperialism, and then we have to propose and defend defeatism and pacifism. That is, each one against its own imperialist. Okay, for the Russian people and leftists to fight against Putin, that is their job. But we fight against NATO, we fight against Macron here and so on. And so we have some of our French leftists who go in demonstration saying Macron and NATO out of Ukraine, as if Macron and NATO was aggressing Ukraine. So that is absolutely impossible. So it is not to renounce our criticism to Macron and our criticism to NATO, but to understand that we can defeat the domination of all kinds of capitalist rulers, and I finish on that, if we understand that the existing war is not a direct war between NATO and Russia. It is a direct war between Russia and Ukraine. And I would not like, and we would not support the transformation of this war into an international war between NATO and Russia. That is not the point. The point is to deliver arms to the Ukrainian resistance, which permits it to defend itself. Defense, it means the combination of defense and offensive, of course, on the ground, but offensive against the Russian occupation of Ukraine. And that is the issue. And I will finish this saying that through the sanctions against great Russian power, it's not sanctions against Russian gas and energy that we must find, but it is sanctioned against fossil productions. And it is not to replace Russian gas by US gas. It is to transform and to launch in Europe and in the world a radical transformation of the productive forces and the organization of the society in order to reduce radically what is destroying the environment today, and both what is destroying the humanity and the population, as Denis just said. So both through sanctions and through the resistance, we have to fight for the precondition for the dissolution of NATO and the dissolution of military expansion in the world. And therefore, we have to build another kind of united nation, and also another kind of union in Europe, which would include Ukraine and Russia, but after the defeat of Putin, of course. So I thank you very much. I must stop. Sorry to have been long.
No, that was fantastic. In fact, one of our questions will be a follow-up. Hopefully we get to it about NATO dissolution, because you commented on that quite a lot, and we have some follow-ups there. Vaush, if you would do the honors to bring it all together.
It would be my pleasure. So I agree with much of what Catherine has said, and I'm deeply concerned about the way the Western left has approached this issue. See, we can't stop this war from happening, not as a singular political force. We can comment on it, and through our commentary, we can achieve a variety of political goals. We can attempt to make the life of working class people better in whatever edge cases we can try for. In this case, I think the working class people of Ukraine are suffering particularly disproportionately, but the people of Russia are as well. The sanctions that are targeting their country are going to have a massive impact on the quality of life of the people of Russia, who, of course, did not, in any meaningful sense, vote in this war. And I think it's worthwhile to talk about these issues in a way that validates the legitimacy of our political perspective. You know, we can also make other people socialists by having good takes on this issue. And that's where I think we're really failing. See, a lot of Western leftists have passively adopted the hegemonic assumption of Western superiority that runs not only in our own countries, but around the world. It is impossible to grow up in the United States or England or France without adopting, at least passively, some kind of innate belief in the superiority of your political bloc. This is done actively and passively. To an extent, this happens in all countries, but we're quite good at it, and we are, of course, the global hegemon. And I think at a certain point, most leftists in the West, they realize actually America or England or France or the West in general is actually bad. They realize this. And it turns, I think, for a lot of them into very much a, oh, my parents aren't as knowledgeable as I thought they were moment. And it breaks them, and they never recover. And they spend the rest of their political careers framing all issues internationally around the framework of Western hegemon bad, which for the most part is true. That's a useful framework, don't get me wrong, but it's not universally useful. The people who have framed, as Catherine pointed out, the current conflict as a war between America and Russia are particularly embarrassing. That is an unsustainable perspective. It is factually and demonstrably incorrect. You know, there are actually a number of comparisons that the Western left have insistently brought up that betray a deep ignorance of geopolitical engagement that is just really bad. I mean, especially given the history of leftism worldwide. You know, we used to be quite good at this, and I think we are sometimes selectively, but as a group, I mean, there are people comparing what's happening right now in Ukraine to the Iraq War. Now, how exactly these things are related in any fashion is a mystery to me. I still don't understand. As far as I can tell, the narrative seems to be America lied about the Iraq War 20 years ago, in 19. Therefore, Ukraine and the rest of the world is lying that Russia's invading. You can't, there's no sense to it, really. It's in one instance, my government did something bad. Therefore, in this case, another government, which is allied with my government, must in some way be impugned by the transitive property of geopolitical nonsense. This is really bad for us in a variety of ways. First of all, of course, it does mar our support for the Ukrainian people. There is no empirical defense of Russia here. Obviously, support should be with Ukraine. To even pretend this is a worthwhile question or subject of discussion is just embarrassing. But it really does mar our perspective somewhat to go, oh, of course, we denounce Russia's behavior. We support Ukraine, you know, and we denounce America's military adventurism into Ukraine. It's like, what are you talking about? That's not happening. And even if it was happening, I mean, these qualifiers, you see these, it's the same thing racists do when they aren't racist, but, you know, when you add a qualifier to a strong political statement, what you're really doing is saying that you only believe that thing with a given set of caveats. And when people say stuff like, as the DSA did, you know, the final third of their statement on the Russia-Ukraine conflict being about America needing to leave NATO, it's like, look, say I agreed with that perspective, as ridiculous as that is, America leaving NATO, you know, sure, fine. And why don't we just completely dissolve the Pentagon? You know, if we want ludicrous proposals, go for it. But to attach that to a statement on the ongoing war effort, why? Well, what it does to the average person is it makes us look like we're wiffle waffling. And that's because a lot of leftists are. There are people all around the world, in Africa, Asia, South America, everywhere around the world, who like America. Sometimes it's because we, whether it's true or not, we represent a kind of ideal of economic and political freedom. I don't think we do, but it's a perception a lot of people hold around the world. Oftentimes it's because of the ubiquity of our culture, our music and our movies, they reach the world, and a lot of people have a sentimental appreciation for the States because of that. And, there are political issues with the spread of that cultural hegemony, but I think there's a categorical difference between support for America abroad and support for Russia abroad. When people around the world like America, oftentimes it's because they like 1990s animated Disney classics. That's sweet. When people in America like Russia, it's because they don't believe that Assad used chemical weapons on his own civilians. It's because they think that Russia had a legitimate geopolitical justification for the invasion of Ukraine. There is a very pointed effort to weaponize sympathy for non-Western geopolitical blocs into a kind of propaganda network. It would be like if there was this huge block of Americans living in, or sorry, not Americans, American sympathizers living in Russia, and their principal investment in America was they believed that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. And that was like the main thing they cared about, and they went on forums to talk about how actually Bush was right. And it's like, I don't think this really happens, but again, America doesn't have a global propaganda network dedicated specifically to continuing to lie about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We stopped that 2 decades ago, thank goodness. Russia today does have a global propaganda network trying to sort of cover for or give defense to its crimes. And I think we should be as critical of that as we rightfully were with our behavior over the Iraq war. If anything, Russia puts less effort into their lies than Bush did with, the weapons of mass destruction bit. A lot of Russian narrative concerning the invasion of Ukraine has been internally contradictory. These pathetic attempts at false flags. They have lied and they have told incompatible internal stories. You have Putin one day saying they're denazifying Ukraine, and then the next day talking about restoring the glory of the Russian Empire, how Lenin made a mistake by allowing for autonomy within the Ukrainian region. These are flatly contradictory arguments, but for some reason, there are a lot of people in the Western left who are just inherently sympathetic to the political defenses put forward by fascist or at least far-right populist countries when they're not a part of Western hegemon, which is very, very, very weird to me. There is no leftist justification for defending Russia in any respect. The term critical support is supposed to refer to exactly that. You're critical of a society, but you support them because they're doing some good, and there's some friction, which is a product in large part of the, like if you want to talk about Cuba, like, okay, fine. Russia is flatly far right and autocratic. There is nothing, not a single thing about it, which is it. America is closer to socialism than Russia is. They're both very far, and somehow America is closer. It's worse than us in almost every demonstrable way. But yet this insistent narrative that because they're not part of the Western hegemon, it's a form of American exceptionalism done in reverse. How America and the West broadly, which we have tremendous control over, must be the root, not of all good in the world, but of all evil. That it is the central, radiating force of unwellness and anti-socialism that must be opposed as a first principle. And every other principle, such as the autocracy or fascism or reactionary politics or military adventurism of Putin, those are secondary. The first priority is to attack the West. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm fine with attacking the West, but it has to be over real issues with real arguments. And all this really does is make us look like absolute lunatics to people who might otherwise be amenable to our perspectives. Now, I'm not saying that liberals are going to all flaunt to us if we take a different issue or take a different stance on this issue. They're not. Liberals are obstinate in their own way. But I do know that we are made to look more radical in a very indefensible way and less approachable when these are the types of issues that we choose to die on the hill of. This should be a simple one. When Russia, a far-right country, invades Ukraine over false pretenses, while their leader, Putin, is giving blood and soil justifications for doing so, that anything could be produced from the left, but unilateral condemnation is an embarrassment for us. It muddies the waters, it cheapens our message, and it makes it difficult to recruit and approach people. We need to bury the legacy of the the Soviet leftists. The Soviet Union is gone and frankly was never good. All it does now, this interminable association, is cheapen us. In contrast, it makes us look like a bunch of, ailing diehards who are attached to an old world order and don't have anything reasonable or meaningful to say about the world as it exists today. That is very destructive for our image, and it's exactly in line with the propaganda that far-right groups have tried to push onto us since the end of the Cold War. The idea that we're really just relics of a bygone era that are sort of jealously hanging on to the image of a dead Soviet empire because we're mad that we lost. This is a bad avenue to take, and we should stop. That's at the end of the day, I think that's one of the most important things that the Western left has to do if we're to become relevant in the eyes of a broader range of prospective converts.
Thank you so much. We have about a half an hour left, give or take, maybe give, I'm not sure. But at the same time, I'm not going to time anybody. We do have a bunch of questions to get to, but again, if it's a good discussion going, I'm not going to step in. I just ask that everyone please be respectful. They are pretty much open to the entire field. So the first question is, what does a realistic exit plan look like for Putin, assuming that Ukraine would agree to this?
I will say, I don't think there's any potential whatsoever for Putin to order a retreat unless he was able to secure a concession. There's too much yes men egoism present there. For him to issue a full retreat, to me, seems very unlikely. I don't know if there's anything, any loss he could suffer that would allow him to let that up on his ego.
I would suppose that it really will depend heavily on this balance of forces, and actually it's another point for in argument for arming and defending Ukraine, because those people who had the experience of union organizing, they know very well when you are negotiating, bargaining against a powerful boss who has the power and who can crush you, you need to have some power behind you as well. And just in order to get him to the table and to have a proper negotiation when he will really treat you as a subject, as somebody, you need to really push him to get him there. So it really depends on how the ongoing stage of war. Now they declared that they have this second phase of so-called special military operation that is aimed on grabbing not just eastern Ukraine, Donbass and nearby regions, but also the southern Ukraine, cutting off Ukraine from the Black Sea and probably getting to Odessa and then to the Moldovan border. How it will really go on, and but at the same time we saw that there were so many failures on the side of Russia in terms of logistics and many other stuff, that at the other side we have this unity in the Ukrainian resistance that gives us some hopes that we will somehow push him to negotiate. But still, I'm really a bit concerned with even the question when we constantly try maybe to provide Putin some way out, to that we need to think how he will have a some dignified way to retreat. I think it's really even how we put this question, it's really important not to try to justify the aggressor.
Catherine or Hannah, would either of you like a crack at this one, or are you good with what was said?
Just to say that I'm convinced that that Putin's aim is so radical, that he cannot exit like that, and that you cannot offer him something. I mean, it would mean what? Do you propose that Ukrainian population and powers stop resisting? What? Well, but what is weak? What are his weakness is important to stress. It has been already said. First, the morale of the army. The young people who are integrated in the troop, in the forces, are confronted to a resistance which is much stronger than they thought. But there is another problem in Belarus. There is today a strong repression, which is important to stress, against trade unionists. Which oppose the war and which oppose the support of the war by Lukashenko, and this is an element which can weaken Putin, and I put emphasis on that thing, and it means that we will try in Europe to organize trade union solidarity to protect all those trade unionists to resist Putin's war in Belarus in particular. So that is an important aspect. I want to stress a second aspect which weaken Putin, which is the fact that the society in Kazakhstan is divided also. And he hasn't received a clear-cut support here. And on the contrary, because the society also in Kazakhstan is complex, combined with the people cannot understand also such aggression. So Putin's weakness and his defeat can come also from reactions in the other countries around Russia. That's the point I wanted to stress.
All right. Any other comments about what a realistic exit plan would look like for Putin, or shall I move on? No. All right. In that case, I'm going to jump around the questions a little bit. I'm going to be very respectful of the time. I know it's late for many of you. The next question is about what would NATO dissolution actually look like? And is this an achievable an achievable aim from the left?
I'd like to jump in on that if I may, since my opinions might diverge somewhat. Countries that have shared military goals are going to form military alliances. NATO and its existence are just an emergent property of a need at the part of the countries that are a part of it to form such a military alliance. An issue that I have with opposition to NATO is that so often what people are really opposing is the political and military hegemon of the countries that make up NATO rather than NATO itself. The archetype, the framework that we're talking about here is really just a military alliance, unexceptional, plenty exist all around the world. NATO is unique only in the strength of its alliance, of course, with Western Europe and America making it up. Obviously, it would be the strongest military alliance by far. But there can be no dissolution of NATO in a world where there's a shared military interest between, well, the North Atlantic countries and whatever else they decide is a worthwhile addition. Just because that's you could only ban military alliances internationally. It just seems like a natural byproduct. I think the real goal should be to try to adjust the geopolitical circumstances both of existing NATO countries and their neighbors to make NATO a vestigial organization, something entirely antiquated, which I feel it would be if it weren't for Russia's insistent antagonism in Eastern Europe. NATO, if it were just some meaningless vestigial framework that these countries were a part of, you contribute your so-and-so to national defense, I don't think anyone would talk about it. I feel like it's often over-fixated on as the wing of Western imperialism, when in reality, the World Bank and the IMF are the wings of Western imperialism. It's cultural and economic. The idea that NATO is like the envoy, the Valkyrie of Western power worldwide, that is simply not true. It's our businesses, American and Western European businesses, work in tandem with the World Bank and the IMF to set up favorable business conditions in countries that have very low average wages and low levels of human development, and thus they exploit the labor and the resources there. That's how we do it. The NATO. Well, I'll tell you one group that actually does mind NATO. It's Russia. And so often the perspective that we hear about what being a good international leftist is comes from Russia. It does. Like, let's not pretend that RT hasn't been one of the loudest voices in supplying this narrative. They don't like NATO because it keeps them from invading, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Let's be real. Apart from that, I think it's a tangential issue that ideally would dissolve given better political circumstances.
Would anyone else like to jump in on this?
Well, actually, I tend to agree. So our goal is really to make NATO obsolete. One may argue that actually in the 90s, what Catherine has said, that it was actually the moment when the European security architecture could be rebuilt around, for instance, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. But unfortunately, that moment was lost. And when Russia was annexing Crimea, the only dissenting member of the Russian parliament, Ilya Ponomaryov, he said, who voted against, he said that this decision, it actually pushes Ukraine into the arms of NATO. And now Putin's aggression against Ukraine is pushing Sweden and Finland to the arms of NATO. So actually, we can say that the best propagandist for NATO is Vladimir Putin himself, and he is the reason for this existence of NATO. And we can say that at this moment, probably the ruling classes in different members of NATO, they have different motivations. So obviously the US needs NATO to link Europe and subjugate in some way. Western Europe needs NATO to reduce its military spending, and it was what Trump tried to impose on them, these increases. And Eastern Europe is really concerned with the prospects of some Russian aggression, and they see it as something inevitable to have some shared protection. And actually, again, Catherine also described how the support for NATO membership in Ukraine increased due to precisely the Russian aggression. So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah. So really, we need to just dismantle the existing system of this inter-imperialist competition. And it can be provided only by completely other type of politics, including this international politics.
Yes, I share what Denis just said. Unfortunately, for the moment, Putin, one of the first, I said one of the effect of Putin's war was to consolidate Ukrainian resistance, but it was also to consolidate NATO. And at immediate level. So, but I would say that several aspects should be discussed in between now and the dissolution, the condition of a dissolution of NATO. First, the question which is discussed by Gilbert Achcar in the recent article published in Jacobin, which is about the increased budgets, military budgets. The idea that sending arms for Ukraine means the increasing of military budget everywhere is absolutely wrong. There is a huge discrepancy between the level of those military budgets and what is used for Ukraine and what is needed even for Ukraine. So I mean, it is a complete hypocrisy, and this has to be denounced. And for instance, also our German comrades, for instance, could both agree to support Ukrainian resistance and disagree with the global consolidation of such a budget and of a NATO construction. So, I mean, so that's one element. And an argument against such a budget is first also to the issue of what is another humanitarian urgency in front of the climate crisis and in front of the COVID crisis, that is the health crisis, that is the priorities for the society, using the budget for something else. And also using, and Gilbert Achcar also stressed one thing. He said in front of the Second World War, there was huge changes in the budget precisely, but also in the production, what is produced when it was for a world war. Is there the need for a budget for a world war? The issue of nuclear dangers and the fact that there is there is a regional real problem for Eastern European countries, for those who are around Russia, but there is no danger of a world war and no need for such budget of a world war, and with the nuclear dimensions of that. So the concrete treaties for disarmament, concrete treaties for denuclearization are also intermediate dimensions for the fight against the global increase of NATO. So I would stress this aspect.
You're good, Hanna? Nope. All right. Well, we have two more questions that we can get through. I want to tie this one together, and then we're going to end on a question about sanctions. So we're kind of going to skip over the IMF because I think that will be a little bit too involved and deep, or at least lengthy. Hanna, you had mentioned specifically that Putin fears the people, that in many respects, NATO is a smokescreen. Hopefully I'm not misunderstanding or misexpressing what you had spoken about earlier. I wanted to get the panel's thoughts on this. And if I was saying that incorrectly at all, Hanna, I'll let you lead off to maybe correct that statement.
It's more or less what I wanted to say, but the fact it's not to say that the NATO expansion is a non-existent thing. It's not to misunderstand the real causes of the wars Putin are starting, not only in Ukraine, but also in the other countries like Georgia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, etc. And he didn't started the invasion of these countries because of NATO. He started the invasion of all his post-Soviet neighbors when in these post-Soviet countries people wanted to make a revolution or to put into question the autocratic regimes. So yeah, we can say that the discourse about the NATO expansion is a smokescreen, but the NATO expansion itself exists, and like Catherine explained very well, and Denis. So yeah, if somebody has a comments on it.
Yeah, I just think that even if that was the case, that NATO expansionism is prompting Russian aggression, which I don't believe it is, there's a critical difference between an explanation and a justification. If you're conflating the two, then you normalize a lot of really bad political principles. After all, fear of an international Jewish banking class was one of the listed justifications for the war crimes of Nazi Germany, but nobody here, nobody sane, would use that as a defense or a justification of what they did. Listed reasons, perceived fears, these are useful in a sociological sense. Why are people doing what they're doing? What reasons do they have? What motivations do they have? How can you convince them otherwise? But to use them as a moral defense or as a prescription is very, very dangerous. After all, if you look at the history of Putin's regime, it's not as though his criticisms have been relayed exclusively at Western hegemony. There have been plenty of internal ethnic and identity-oriented criticisms that he's made, that he's used to justify very reactionary policies he's put through, pertaining to, for example, gay people. Would we take him at face value when he says that the corruption of Russian culture and the degradation of Russian masculinity are the reasons he had no choice but to, criminalize the depiction of homosexuality on media? If you take that too far, if you take that any distance, really, it's ridiculous. Whatever the reasons he may think he has, the invasion is unjustified. There's no moving past that.
Yeah, just wanted to add one more sentence about the what was just said, and about maybe historical parallels we can make. We can say that actually not NATO is kind of responsible for mishandling the victory or the situation after the victory of the Western Bloc in the Cold War, just as European powers also were responsible for mishandling Germany's defeat in the World War I, in the First World War. But if we made it parallel, we can say that Ukrainians are no more victims of NATO than the Jews were victims of the Treaty of Versailles, saying that there is not, just to give a comment on what was just said.
Yes, I can just add something. First of all, to repeat what Anna said about the use of what is the formulation, using NATO as a smokescreen. On one aspect, it was a smokescreen because in fact, Putin's main real motivation was explained by himself, saying that he was fighting against Lenin's recognition of the right of self-determination of Ukraine. That has nothing to do with NATO. So the great Russian dimension of Putin's aggression has nothing to do with NATO. It has to do with that great Russian ideology. Second, it is of course true that, as I said, the fact that NATO was maintained is a problem not for Putin, for everyone. It was a problem, like it was just said by Denis also, that there was a period where, of course, international actors and the left in particular should have fought against the situation. But what is important is what is said just now also, to distinguish explanation of a context and justification. The explanation of the way NATO was maintained and expanded is in no way a justification of Putin's war, and de facto produce the exact opposite effect on NATO. That is the consolidation of, for the moment, of NATO. That's all.
I
All
would
right.
probably say just a couple of words that yeah, you have a traditional hegemon in a region, a traditional empire there. For instance, as you have the United States and Latin American states, and it treats it as its backyard, all this region, and when it feels that it has to intervene, it may invoke some security concerns, yes. Just like, again, Reagan's administration was saying that there are some threats from Grenada, so we need to intervene there, or we need to again back some right-wing dictatorships in Central America, because some foreign powers may get to our borders. And you can see some parallels with Russian justifications, but really, Russian regime at its core, it's really afraid of any kind of popular mobilization, and it was suppressing it on its own territory and also in the neighboring countries. And it's like in the mid 19th century, in times of Marx, the Russian Tsar Nicholas I was called the gendarme of Europe because he was eager to suppress any kind of revolution. The same Putin and his ultra-conservative, borderline fascist ideology. Now it's, we can say it's full-fledged fascist. It's really very anti-revolutionary and anti-popular in the sense that it denies any kind of agency for the masses as well. And it regards any revolution, any revolt, any protest as something that it has to be some conspiracy behind it. It has to be some foreign power meddling. The people cannot push their discontent to some revolution on their own. It's some game of foreign intelligence, and it's the motivation for its own suppression of Russian opposition as well, and Russian anti-war movement now.
I want to add some comment on that. I fully agree with what Denis just said. I only want to add that this kind of interpretation is not only Putin's kind of interpretation. It is shared by a large part of the left in the West. That is, when I said in the beginning that I support the need for the left to put emphasis on the society, its evolution, its complexity, and so on. It is an opposition to this other part of the left, which reduce all social movement to completely marginal agency, completely dominated by world conspiracy. And of course, there is an element of truth on the fact that all powers, by the way, be it Russia or be it all the Western powers, and in particular US power, are using all social upsurges and revolutions for their own interests, and are trying to corrupt those movements. So this is a huge reality that we should not underestimate. That is, it was true in against the Polish upsurge and events and trade union at the turn of the 80s with Solidarność, and afterwards it was also true against minor trade strikes in Soviet Union, and later on in all movement in Arab Spring and elsewhere, that the US and all big power tried to corrupt the movements. That doesn't mean that the movements were since the very beginning instrumentalized and lost completely agency. This is the point. And for instance, to come back on Ukraine, I think that there is also, for instance, a big difference between the illusions that the Ukrainian population could have in the so-called democratic parties, which were supported by the West in the Orange Revolution of 2004, and then 2014, because in 2014, the population could, as a real actor, I would say, in its complexity, could make a certain concrete judgment on all those parties which were presented as so-called democratic, civilized, and pro-European, and which became very rapidly completely corrupted and dominated by different oligarchic interests and so on. And therefore, in 2014 and since then, in all the political life in Ukraine up to now, there is a big crisis of all political parties, be they fascist, be they be they liberals, pro-UA and so on. They have big difficulties and to win the confidence of the population, to be, and that is because there is also this experience of strong corruption from everywhere, and we should not underestimate and suppress the criticism of the corruption coming from all sides. Corruption from the Russian power with gas, energy, and so on and so forth, and corruption from the forces of the protectorate, for instance, in Kosovo, from the European Union or from the US. So this is to say that at the very moment when we criticize this presentation of the situation from Putin or from the left, which reduce any agency from the society, we must not underestimate the real power of corruption from all those powers. That is unfortunately one of our problems.
All right. I know we've run a little bit late. We have one final question. I hope that this is not too late for our panelists. One last one.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. This is how we're going to end the night. Is we want to know what sanctions, if any, should we, and we in this case means USA and European leftists, what should we support on Russia?
I will simply say that we should support whatever level of sanctions are necessary to make it extremely clear to the people in Russia who do make these decisions that there is absolutely nothing of worth to be gained through warfare. Nobody will profit from it on their end. It will be universally destructive. If it foments antagonism and discontent within the population, that is desirable as well, to the extent that their country needs a contented population, which is not broadly true. Unfortunately, we're just dealing with higher stakes here. Russia has a tremendous supply of nuclear weapons. And if they continue down the path they have been going down for the past couple of decades, I fear they might one day use them with their military adventurism, their constant nuclear posturing with their neighbors. It seems like that government is uniquely unstable when it comes to its use of these weapons. And I don't think there's any solution to this problem outside of redirecting Russia's current course of behavior towards one which involves more soft power and less hard power. If they want to bully their neighbors with trade deals like we do, then at least that doesn't contain within it the potential to end the world in nuclear hellfire. But the direction things are going right now, hardly a week goes by without them threatening to nuke the West. And it's not like they're North Korea with, 3 warheads and a shanty ICBM that was probably made with duct tape. They could do it. I fear that as difficult as the path is, whatever direction we can push them on, which is not the one they're on currently, is ideal, and sanctions are a way to do this. Ideally, ones which target the oligarchs. And when that is done, and when the direction is changed, I think we should spare no expense in rebuilding Russia, not with NGOs and cynical, World Bank cash grabs, but a real effort to fix the damage we've done to the working class in Russia. We're only doing this insofar as it changes the political, maneuvering of their country, not to punish the people over there.
Would anyone else like to weigh in on this question about Russian sanctions, if any?
Well, maybe yes, a few words about the sanctions. I think the only important and really game-changing sanction against Russia is the embargo on oil and gas. And I'm sorry if I will repeat some arguments from what was just said, because I had a bad connection. So unfortunately, I didn't hear the previous speaker. Just wanted to say that the only way to stop Putin is to deprive him of financial resources to continue the war. And the Russian economics is fully based on the exploitation of fossil fuels and gas, that means gas and oil. And it's also important to say, to emphasize that the embargo must be total and not partial, because if Russia had still money, it will direct this money to finance the war and will completely abandon all the social obligations toward its population that would just starve. Putin will continue this war as long as he has money to do it. And it's crucial to say that the embargo will be in place until Russia can provide credible proof of no further aggression in Ukraine, that it will withdraw its troops from Ukraine, and also can give a proof that it will not continue its aggression elsewhere. And we can understand that it will not be capable to give such kind of proof as long as Putin is in power. I think also it's important to say that not implementing such kind of total embargo on oil and gas from Russia will firstly prolongate the war in Ukraine, which already has a very high economic costs, of course, in Ukraine, but also for Europe, for example, and of course for Russia. And the prolongation of this war means also the crisis in the Middle Eastern and North African countries, which are totally dependent on the exportation of Russian and Ukrainian agricultural products. And if now we have 4 million refugees from Ukraine that go to the Western Europe, in a few more years, or maybe in 1 year, if the war continues, we will have a lot of more refugees coming from other countries because of the famine, because of the fact that there will be nothing to eat there. And I think we must take it take it seriously. So the only way to avoid this global humanitarian catastrophe and political catastrophe is to stop this war as quickly as possible. And also there is a problem that this short-term economic vision that states that Europe and other countries will lose a lot if they cut oil and Russian gas. It fails actually to capture the costs, the possible costs from the further continuation and the escalation of war that, as I said, threatens to involve more countries with potentially very catastrophic consequences. So we need to compare, we have no reasons to compare the situation of embargo with the status quo. The status quo doesn't exist. We are going towards the global crisis on many levels, and we need to compare two situations. We cut oil and gas now, or the war will continue and will cost thousands and millions of deaths, not only in Ukraine, but possibly in the other countries.
Denis, you want to add something?
I wanted to second what Vaush and Hanna have said. So yeah, it's Putin's regime is threatening the world not just with nuclear arms, but also weaponizing this issue of hunger. And the people in the countries of the global south, they will be really the most suffering in this case. And that's why we need to put maximum pressure on the Russian ruling class. And this obviously the main part is this embargo on Russian fossil fuels. But also when we have all these sanctions against the Russian oligarchs and the Russian members of the Russian ruling elites, that is this nexus of oligarchs, bureaucrats, and security forces leaders, siloviki, it still has too many exemptions and loopholes that are rooted in the system of the global capitalism that has lots of tax havens, lots of other ways to for money laundering and all this stuff. When you actually like Russian and also Ukrainian oligarchs, and I suppose it's the majority of the capitalist classes throughout the world, they rob their populations and then store that wealth, that assets somewhere abroad where the taxation is more preferable for them. So we also need to connect this question to the demand for dismantling the current system, this offshore capitalism of tax havens. And again, we need to really make the life of the Russian elites, it's not just a couple of oligarchs, but also in general these rich people who also benefited from the systems that Putin was safeguarding, to make their life I don't know, really unsufferable. I don't know how to really push them to this point when they will be forced to do concessions, because it's really a very urgent question, and every day of this war it brings more deaths in Ukraine, and it also threatens more lives abroad as well.
All right, in the interest of time, Catherine, I think you had something to say, so I'm going to give you the final words of the night. So it's on you.
Well, I fully agree with what has been said. It's only to finish on open question for further debates, because we need to follow new process which are ongoing now. First, behind the sanctions, the financial sanctions, there is a new issue which is raised more and more, and which will be raised more and more, which is the reorganization of the monetary system, world monetary system. The crisis of the domination of the dollar is something which was not forcible, but which is behind the fact that the sanctions on monetary dimensions pushes towards the use of other currencies and other forms of relations. So that's one point to be discussed. And the second point to be discussed is the follow-up of the left, the action of the left in each countries, in order that the more depossessed part of the population do not suffer the most of the effect of the crisis in general. And for instance, the fact that our own oligarch and our own rich people in the West should be precisely attacked themselves in order to protect the level of life of the workers and of the poorest part of the population in the context of the crisis. That's all. Okay, I stop there.
All right, I want to thank everybody for showing up. It was a real pleasure. I hope everyone enjoyed it and hopefully learned something. Catherine, Vaush, Denis, Hanna, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, Robert.
All right, I'm going to stop the recording. And thanks everybody again.